Welcome to Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment. I'm Ron Scholl. Last time on Gas, when a Montana rail link train derailed outside Alberton, Montana, killing one rider, the engineers struggled to escape the release of toxic chlorine gas. As they managed to finally get free and drive their train to Petty Creek 4 miles east, the gas spread in all directions. We now continue with Part 1, Chapter 2, Flash. Epigraph: Your lungs are on fire. Motorist on the highway. Shudder pulled the pin on the first of two cars behind the engine, still on track. The next 19 cars derailed. 2 cars of frozen potatoes, sodium chlorate, 2 lumber cars, 2 with aluminum bars, bags of lignin pitch, 4 liquid chlorine tanks, a tank of liquid waste called potassium cressolate, fencing, an empty gondola, 2 cars with cans of food, solid hazardous waste, and a car of dried peas. A grocery list not atypical for a train. In these ingredients, however, were the makings of a chemistry experiment. All the recipe had lacked was break seals and mix vigorously. The worst jam included the 5 tankers, cars 11 through 15, which jackknifed. Wrenched free of their couplings, they slammed together like river logs at ground zero for failed rail. The gross weight of each chlorine tank was over 250,000 pounds, the heft of the biggest sauropods, tossed like dice. Snake eyes. As car 13 of liquid chlorine popped from the link, cars 11, 12, and 14 of chlorine and car 15, the potassium cressolate, decoupled and collided, smashing their ends into one another. Cars 11, 12, and 14 of chlorine sloshed to a battered rest side by side, perpendicular across the track, followed by the cressolate car, its head angled against the head of car 14 to form an A. Chlorine car 13 rested parallel to the track in the south ditch. On the cressolate car, the weld failed on the head of the A end, opening up a 5-foot half-moon split from top to bottom. Simultaneously, car 14 was pierced by a coupler or draft sill and suffered the largest rupture of a chlorine tank in the U.S. history of derailments. Like test tubes cracked together, the potassium cressolate tank disgorged as car 14 burst chlorine. As if an afterthought, car 5, a hopper of dry prills of sodium chlorate, toppled and disgorged wads of toxic cargo. In the ditch just southwest of the tankers, the empty gondola came to rest with the battered John Elmer Smith and Lucky. The rest of the train included a load of butane and hydrochloric acid. In the immediate aftermath, no one knew what had leaked, except at least 1 tank of liquid chlorine. On Earth, liquid chlorine does not exist in nature, and neither does chlorine gas, from the Greek chloros for greenish yellow. The pure gas appears green, the liquid amber. Manufactured from sodium chloride, salt, chlorine gas is liquefied by compression and injected into tanks for storage and transport. Liquid chlorine boils at minus 29 degrees Fahrenheit, but tank pressure allows chlorine to remain a liquid at ambient temperatures. The outside of the steel tank has several inches of thermal insulation to prevent heating to excessive pressure. A tank of chlorine is normally 85% liquid with a floating pad of vapor. With a penetrating breach, a chlorine tank is a chemical bomb. If the rupture lies above the liquid line, chlorine vapor explosively vents. The drop in pressure allows the liquid chlorine inside to boil, releasing more vapor. More likely, the hole will be somewhere in the liquid level. Under decompression, chlorine is rapidly forced through the hole as it boils and vaporizes, and in this moment of violent transformation, the chlorine gas expands about 460 times its liquid volume. In this instantaneous release, much liquid flashes into a vapor cloud. The EPA's Chris Weiss said of Alberton's release, "When the tank was split open, there was an explosive release, which you probably could have heard from miles away. It must have made a horrible noise." Plateau Road resident Richard Johnson heard a explosion that rocked our home to the point that the window shades were swinging. Hypothetically, 180,000 pounds of liquid chlorine expands to a cube over 91 feet long on all sides of pure chlorine gas. 1 million parts per million, or ppm. A cloud of searing acid. A mere 10 parts per million is the IDLH level for chlorine, the level immediately dangerous to life and health. Following the math of our theoretical cube chlorine gas cloud, the IDLH of 10 parts per million would fill a cube 4,325 feet in all directions, over 4/5 of a mile. A cube of 1 part per million, still highly irritating, would be 1.74 miles on every side. But any cloud would not be a cube. The violent expansion of chlorine gas creates turbulence, quickly expanding the flash cloud into a sphere or hemisphere. The energetic conversion pulls heat out of the air, and as energy dissipates in the cooling cloud, the dense gas settles under gravity, spreading and flattening like a pancake, before moving with any wind or rising again as it mixes with air. Following the flash burst, tank pressure reaches equilibrium with the atmosphere, and the release transitions into a continuous vapor release as the remaining liquid surface boils and evaporates. Observations have revealed that a large rupture low on the tank may also allow some liquid chlorine to pool on the ground temporarily. The Alberton area was subject to 2 initial chlorine gas assaults. The large flash vapor cloud energetically expelled during the initial rupture, and the continuous release from ongoing boiling of liquid chlorine that remained. Now the gas was subject to gravity and wind. At 2.5 times the density of air, pure chlorine gas sinks. The behavior of the mixing gas then depends on air temperature, moisture levels, and turbulence. The vapor diffuses slowly in still air. Warm, humid, windy conditions produce faster reactions and dissipation. As the gas reacts with air moisture, it becomes less dense and begins to spread out and rise. In modeling, it makes a cone-shaped plume under wind from one direction. On a cool, wet, and fairly calm night, such as April 11, concentrated gas initially moved downhill, but mixing gas was also nudged by light winds, even uphill, evidenced by the low creeping mist that overtook and infiltrated Caswell and Shutter's engine, and which B.J. McComb saw creep over the Natural Pier Bridge, a deadly seep moving upriver. The men would have been oblivious of any flash vapor cloud aloft in the dark valley. Back in the tank, another process evolved. Boiling and evaporation of liquid chlorine extracts heat from the liquid, dropping both tank and liquid temperature. The supercold liquid also absorbs water vapor from the air and may form chlorine hydrate crystals and a skin of insulating ice. The liquid chlorine auto-refrigerates, ceasing evaporation for the time being. As the ambient temperatures warm the surface ice, boiling and evaporation resumes, and a cycle of freeze and thaw results that could take days to complete the vaporization of any remaining liquid chlorine. Likewise, any chlorine spilled on the ground initially boils and evaporates vigorously, but cooling of the ground and any chlorine hydrate ice may cause auto-refrigeration that leaves a chlorine pool or pocket in the soil to evaporate sporadically. In short order, the chlorine tank breach cascades from a flash burst to a continuous vapor release to an unpredictable series of deadly burps. The highly reactive chlorine gas transforms into chlorinated compounds. In the air, moisture and particulates drive the reactions. Chlorine and water vapor, H2O, react to form hydrogen chloride or hydrochloric acid and hypochlorous acid, or HOCl, in a simple equation of equilibrium. Cl2 plus H2O goes to HCl plus HOCl. HCl is a strong acid and HOCl a weak acid, but household bleach is HOCl diluted to 3 to 5%. Even so, a toxic chemical. As the gas cloud moves, it also reacts with metals and organics, oxidizing and corroding. While brass doorknobs in Alberton turn green, green plants bleached yellow or white. Similar acid reactions occur with the moisture of the human airway and eyes. Acids are highly toxic. Even at 1 part per million, prolonged exposure to chlorine can be a serious health threat. On the drizzly night of April 11, chlorine had been unleashed in an unnatural state, like a primordial element from another world, more or less headed in all directions. Its nature was to react with everything. There is always a highway nearby. 21-year-old Sam Austin was en route east on I-90, headed to the University of Montana after spring break, asleep in the passenger seat of the car driven by his cousin, Trina Korst, 24. Asleep in the back was his 12-year-old cousin, Justin. As they entered the Alberton Canyon in the dead of night, Korst prodded Austin awake at the eerie sight of a greenish-white fog in the headlights. Dew formed on the windshield. They slowed as they entered it, and then the reek of chlorine seeped in through the vents and Austin's cracked window. The group gagged and coughed, and Justin buried his face in cushions. They quickly closed the vents and window, but the circulation system still allowed in some outside air. Everyone's eyes teared and noses ran, and Austin felt a piercing pain in his chest. He had a history of resolved childhood asthma. Corse panicked. Where had this come from? "Turn around," Austin cried, knowing from his ROTC training that this was a deadly gas. But an 18-wheeler right behind them, air horn blaring, prodded them slowly forward through the cloud. Visibility was near zero in the white blank mass that submerged the car, Austin recalled. After creeping a while at 1 to 2 miles per hour, Corse stopped, unsure of the road edge. The car felt like a gas chamber. Austin implored his cousin to drive. "If we stay here, we're going to die." Dizzy, he struggled to breathe and stay conscious. Austin described a mild asthma attack as trying to breathe through a straw without using his nostrils. Ahead, lights flashed, and Austin hoped it was an ambulance. But as they pulled alongside a vehicle in the muddy median, an older man abruptly materialized through the fog at Corse's window, pleading for help, his beet-red face streaming tears. Corse wanted to let him in, but Austin warned, "We can't help him. We'll probably die ourselves." The decision would tear at him later, but he feared that if they opened the door, they could all die. With his history of asthma, Austin may well have. "You just feel so helpless," he recalled. The desperate man standing in the road was swallowed by toxic fog as the car inched away. Despite the gas fog and her streaming eyes, Corse managed to use the shoulder guardrail as a guide, and it took about 20 to 30 minutes to completely escape the dense cloud before they could pull over and try to recover. All the time, they wheezed and vomited mucus. Austin reported smelling the gas for up to 10 miles until about the 9-mile exit atop a hill. As the gas cloud engulfed the highway, many drivers converged in a chaotic scene directly across from the spill. The man Sam Austin feared helping was Lester Miller, 67, of Indiana. He and his wife Sharon, 57, had driven into the thick rolling cloud around mile marker 73 as they headed east and errantly drove their car into the interstate's muddy divider ditch. Stranded and fearing death, Lester desperately flagged traffic. Driver after driver refused to help until finally Australian tourist Cook Chun Lee and his 18-year-old son Christopher stopped their camper. "At first we thought the smell was sulfur from a hot spring," Christopher later said from his hospital bed. His father was a chemistry teacher. "My father recognized the smell and knew what happens with chlorine gas. We had to stop and help them," he said. The Lees were credited with saving the Millers' lives. Lester agreed. "I owe my life to him," he said of the elder Lee. "We are no one special," Cook Chun told reporters. "Someone was crying for help in the night. Anyone else should have done the same." But on the highway, the Lees too were soon in physical distress and confused by the gas cloud in the dark. At one point, the elder Lee asked the driver behind them if they could all sit on top of the other car, but he was turned away. Next, Lee stopped a truck in hopes of hitching a ride. Alberta, Canada natives Lane Atwood and his son Steve were long-hauling east from Vancouver. In the cab sleeper, Lane awoke to a burning throat and eyes amid an unusual dark fog with an unidentifiable smell. "It was burning our lungs and eyes," 60-year-old Lane reported. "It takes your breath away. You feel like your lungs are on fire." They had no room for the 4 people in distress, but the truck is said to follow their taillights. Several other headlights fell in behind them, as if the truck led a gruesome parade, until the fog cleared half an hour later, somewhere in the approach to Missoula. Sam Austin's group was apparently the first at an emergency room at downtown Missoula's St. Patrick Hospital. Austin could barely breathe when he arrived. The ER crew, he said, didn't even know anything about a chemical spill. They just heard something about a train derailment. So after about 7 to 10 minutes of deliberation with them, they finally decided that they would treat us. Austin said he and his 2 cousins never received any decontamination at St. Patrick Hospital. He was admitted overnight, not showered, and his unlaundered clothes, which still reeked, were returned to him the next day. The Millers and Lees became acutely ill. That morning, both Millers lost consciousness at times, and Sharon Miller and the elder Lee were hospitalized in critical condition for several days. Lester Miller had bleeding from his lungs, and doctors feared Sharon, on a ventilator for 8.5 days, might die. A file later noted, Mr. Lee says he loves Montana and the mountains, but realized he came at the wrong time of year, the chlorine season. Unfamiliar with Missoula, once free of the gas cloud, the Atwoods continued driving 90 more miles to a Butte truck stop where they had planned to eat and refuel, though Steve couldn't see well enough to drive and both men wheezed, coughed, and vomited. They finally called 911 at the truck stop and were admitted to a Butte hospital for about 4 days. The Atwoods' refrigerated truck carried a cargo of flowers. According to an official, the relief driver was also overcome and hospitalized in Bozeman when he attempted to unload the vehicle, an indication of cross-contamination. The Lees at first noted a sulfur smell, and Sam Austin recalled he and his cousins smelled more than chlorine that morning. Definitely sulfur, he said. Sulfur and chlorine. There was some other smell there that we couldn't make out. Some people later said pesticides. This was kind of like a pesticide, but it smelled toxic, you know? The Millers recall a, quote, chemical smell, not chlorine. When asked if it could have been a pesticide or fertilizer smell, Sharon said, I think it kind of smelled like a pesticide smell to me. About a quarter of a mile north of the spill along I-90, drivers described a gas cloud thick enough to reduce visibility to near zero, which produced intense acute symptoms that resulted in hospitalization for some and critical status. Reported smells suggested that more than chlorine gas had descended upon the highway. Lester Miller believed he flagged close to 10 vehicles headed east to Missoula. No agency ever detailed the highway exposures. Westbound traffic through the area on I-90 was not reported closed until 4:46 a.m. Eastbound traffic remained open until 4:58 a.m. This allowed 40 to 50 minutes of through traffic after the 4:07 a.m. spill, and drivers caught inside closures still had to exit. Steve Atwood thought it about 5 a.m. when they encountered the cloud. Gas had spread east and north and was moving toward Alberton. Next time on Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment, we take a brief pause for some backstory. First, we drop in on a resident of Alberton, Lucinda Hodges, who has found a life for her family amid the history and beauty of western Montana. A life abruptly threatened by a chlorine gas cloud. We also examine how well responders are prepared for a worst-case scenario. Till then, this is Ron Scholl. Thanks for listening. This podcast is adapted from the book Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment. Visit Amazon.com to see the 2-book series. To access support material in the book, such as maps, photos, illustrations, and video links, visit my Facebook page Gas, the true story, or watch my Gas playlist on my YouTube channel at RL Scholl.